Thank you. Hello, everyone. Okay. Hello. My name is Stephanie Lin, and I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture. Thank you so much for coming. It's really great to welcome such a full house, and I'm especially thrilled to welcome our esteemed guest speakers, Nader Tehrani, founding principal of Nader, and Wendell Burnette of Wendell Burnette Architects, who will be moderating the conversation to follow Nader's presentation. This should be a fantastic evening. I've told them I have no agenda, only that we are all eager and excited to see how Nader's approach to making and building, his dedication to intersections of practice and pedagogy, and the integration of material and spatial intelligence in his work will play out in a wide range of contexts and scales, while informing the future practices of our students and other young designers who are in the room tonight. As the title of the talk suggests, Nader's body of work is informed by deep material and tectonic experimentation, and tonight his presentation will focus on wood. Through a variety of engineered timber applications, digital fabrication techniques, geometric exploration, and the developments of craft through deep construction knowledge. The demonstration of these explorations in some of his major architecture school projects, and of which the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Co-Arch Pavilion at the College of Architecture was most recently completed, should also be inspiring to our design studio classes, in which students are currently thinking about campus facilities, sustainable materials, and how acts of innovation demand equally creative material and spatial supports. The school becomes a teaching tool. These are only a fraction of his major projects and include recent ones such as RISD's North Hall Dormitory in Providence, Rhode Island, MIT Site 4, a mixed-use development for Kendall Square in Cambridge, and the upcoming renovation to the Metropolitan Museum of Art's wing for ancient Near Eastern and Cypriot art, scheduled for completion next year. Nader's recent essay exploring the ideology of monomateriality encourages the holistic rethinking of construction labor and building systems as a site for both design opportunity and also economy. His projects in mass timber are as much technical and sustainable projects as they are explorations of cultural agendas and demonstrate the ways in which working with material process and associated technologies is part and parcel to the formation of collective knowledge and ultimately invention. How these conversations will resonate with Wendell's unique design perspective that's particularly tuned to the meditative craft of architecture, its materiality and place, is a conversation to very much look forward to. I last saw the two of them together at the AIA Awards Gala just over a year ago, chaired by Tommy and Patty Suchart, who are here tonight. And it's been on my mind that we need to do something together, considering some of their shared values that have to do with integration and expression in building. So I'm so glad this worked out, and thank you for making the time. Finally, this is a meaningful convergence in a few ways to me, in that it brings together a leader of practice in education who was my dean at the Cooper Union in New York, where I used to teach, years after I first found deep inspiration from his practice as an undergraduate student in the early 2000s, in conversation with another leading architect and educator whom I've gotten to know recently and embodies the unique spirit of contemporary practice in American architecture, and whose own path to practice by way of Taliesin West should be quite inspiring to our students. This event was generously sponsored by Swaback Architects and Planners and the Arizona Architecture Foundation, of which we have some representatives here tonight. Thank you so much for your support. Of course, I want to deeply thank all of the students, staff, faculty, and board members that made this event possible, and some of whom have flown out here just for this event. Following this lecture, there will be a fundraising dinner, and if you're interested in joining us and the guest speakers for that, please let me know. There are still a few limited tickets left. And if you've enjoyed this event at the end and are interested in helping us underwrite, please feel free to approach me afterwards as well. I'd like to just do some bios before we kick off for Nader and Wendell. Nader Tehrani is the principal of NADA, a practice dedicated to the advancement of design innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and an intensive dialogue with the construction industry. For his contributions to architecture as an art, he was the recipient of the 2020 Arnold W. Brunner Memorial Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the highest form of recognition of artistic merit in the United States. He's also been named the 2022 Design Visionary by Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian Museum of Design, and elected in 2023 to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Nader is a professor and former dean of the School of Architecture of the Cooper Union in New York, where he served from 2015 to 2022. He served as the head of the department at MIT, professor at MIT, the Harvard GSD, Rhode Island School of Design, the Georgia Institute of Technologies, Thomas W. Venchelet, Distinguished Chair in Architectural Design, and the University of Toronto's Frank O. Gehry International Visiting Chair. He's also served as the 2017-2018 William A. Bernuti Architect in Residence at the American Academy in Rome. Nader has lectured widely and exhibited work at some of the most renowned institutions. In addition to dozens of awards and honors, his practice has received an unprecedented 19 Progressive Architecture Awards. Wendell Burnette is a self-taught architect with an internationally recognized body of work. Wendell Burnette Architects has been based in Phoenix for over 29 years and their multi-scaled work is concerned with space, light, context, and community. Originally from Nashville, Wendell discovered the Southwest Desert as an apprentice to Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin West. His 11-year association with the studio of Will Bruder culminated in a 6-year design collaboration as a co-designer, project and field architect on the Phoenix Central Library, which was awarded AIA's 25-year award in 2021. Wendell has lectured widely on his firm's work and philosophy internationally. He was a professor of practice at ASU for 15 years and has taught visiting studios at numerous universities across the US, including recently at Harvard GSD. His work is extensively published and recognized, including residential work, public libraries, community centers such as the Palo Verde Library Maryvale Community Center, for which he won the National AIA Honor Award, museums, adaptive reuse, historic preservation, and hospitality, including the Amangiri Resort in southern Utah. He's earned numerous honors for design excellence, including the Young Architects Award from Progressive Architecture Magazine, the Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League of New York, the Academy Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, recognizing an American architect, and over 25 AIA Arizona and AIA Western Mountain Region Design Awards. Again, I'm thrilled to have you both in the room tonight, and thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thanks, Steph. If the image comes on, I'll start also, but just by way of introduction, there are a lot of images tonight. And so the cadence of the talk will also be slow on certain slides, and then I'll go fast on other slides that are self-explanatory. But you can just begin to see that it's called a woodpecker's delight, if only because I thought the woodpecker was a mythical image as I was growing up in Iran, because I didn't imagine such a bird existed, and only came to realize that it's an actual thing, and delightful as it is acoustically in what it does. The reason why wood is on our minds, beyond the fires in Los Angeles and beyond the kind of environmental ravage that is awaiting us, has to do also with a scale of intervention that interests me in the realm of urbanism. Just a few years ago, when we were in school, we thought of the Noli Plan as a kind of basis for urbanism. It's still architectural, it's still something you can document and see, and yet the scale of urbanism at which we operate today has to do with a metrics of data that is on the planetary scale. And so when a volcano erupts, or when a typhoon happens, or when an earthquake happens in Asia somewhere, it ricochets and may have an effect all along the Pacific Rim. And our studies right now can actually collect the data at this scale. What seems apt for me is that, the working with wood, something so common in the US, though maybe less so in Arizona, in this region, but I still see a lot of wood-framed houses, is that it's so elemental, it's so fundamental to the architecture of the US, and so alien to people of my background, where masonry or adobe was the substance of my childhood. But the idea that it's a naturally renewable resource seemed promising as a kind of foundational ecological act. And then, of course, you realize also that it's its precarity also, and its susceptibility to fire is something quite alarming. I was also reminded more recently from the Valerie Trouet lecture at Cooper Union, and her argument revolved around the complexities of carbon capture, namely that with the increasing probabilities of forest fires, like we're witnessing in LA and other places, there is no carbon offset like we want to imagine. So simply thinking we can farm trees as is simply not as good as it sounds. So even working with wood may not get us out of the rut that we're feeling. Anyway, all of this for the next 3 or 4 years may be a non-issue. But the lecture tonight in great part is me learning about wood, something that is probably quite normative to you, but for me, an extraordinary thing. From its raw state as a tree to the way that it may be cut to the different cladding systems or aggregational capacities it has to the more finished architectural conditions that it may sponsor. At a more performative level also that, we recognize that, mass timber or lumber at a large scale will tend to not melt. Its point of yield is different than steel. So it's pretty extraordinary that certain policies and certain laws have not arrived at the doorstep of the United States, what has been done in Sweden and other places. But we got the opportunity to work with CLT as of late in the last 5-10 years. And it gave us an opportunity to reflect not just on the technology, but on the conceptual basis of it. And I love this image. Not only does it remind me of the end grain of plywood, because obviously these are studs, but that the grain of wood is twofold in this image. There's the natural grain of the wood, and then there's the constructed grain, that is how we stack it in a kind of perpendicular stacking to give it the kind of composite strength it yields. So when we look at an image of nature, we take it for granted. The zebra, unlike a horse, is striped. But it's only when I change the image that you are reminded that in fact the stripes are incorrect. The stripes are perpendicular to the torso in the same way that they are to the legs. And so the architecture, let's say, of the grain here is how it turns the corner. Moments like that are the kind of cherry on the cake. But what we do as architects really has nothing to do with nature. So here I go against the grain of Kahn, let's say. We do not really ask the brick what it wants to be. We force it to be what we want it to be. And so the graining of wood is in great part about the willfulness of what we bring to architecture. But it's always an act of mediation. And, one is always humbled by, the reality of materials. And myself, not being a builder, being an architect, let's say, who was cultivated in the art of representation, not in building, came into construction very late. And so even things that normatively anybody here is doing in the workshop came to me much after it. So learning about how the wood is sawn, the difference between a plane saw or water saw, all came quite late to me, but in a delightful way, because here I was practicing almost architect. I never got registered. To learn about, the different veneers of wood. and the possibility through our early career to do installations that worked not only with the grain of wood, but a kind of panelization that allowed for a mass customized geometry that would enact a bowstring truss condition. This is an installation early in our career at the GSD in collaboration with students, where we concocted essentially a hanging veneer, but behind it had members that would have compressive and tensile elements using the bottom chord of the veneer in tension essentially to create this condition. All of this also resulted in a series of pieces of furniture, always in plywood, where we got to play with the kind of combination of wood in its raw material performative capacity and wood as a language. So on the left, we needed to design a shelving system that was open to both the living and dining room side, meaning it had no back. By not having a back, essentially it didn't have a shear plate. And so we had to make a moment frame out of the shelving system. And so we created a composite sandwich of plywood and steel, still not strong enough, and unwound the wood around the corner, essentially, to give depth where the moment connection would need to be. Similarly, we were interested in this product that we found from Portland, Oregon, which was basically factory floor samples of end-grained wood, but they have it in plywood also. So we said, well, what if we do a line of furniture just out of end-grained plywood? Because it's almost a butcher block technology. It's almost masonry. And as we looked at that, we realized that there's a kind of semantic equivalence between the end-grain plywood and zebra wood, and of course, quarter sawn walnut. And so in this middle image, you see the impossibility that even Palladio had to succumb to. How do you turn corners at the same time? It's easy to turn one corner as you go across the plane of the top of the table and down one side. It's also easy to create a symmetry around the corner on the oblique. But finally, when you come to wrapping the wood back up, there's always this perpendicular moment where these two grains come into contradiction with each other. At any rate, you're looking at all of these grains conspiring for primacy as they deal with each other in both similarity and difference. And finally, on the right side, it's a wooden chest, basically, for jewelry, for underwear, for sweaters, as they rusticate towards the bottom, the structure of which is concealed in the inner liminal spaces between the drawers as the drawers of monolithic stacked plywood cantilever out improbably in the way that it does, for us became a kind of proto-architecture before we got our commissions. Some of this was then translated into larger pieces of architecture as we began to negotiate between the realities of existing buildings and the possibility of building at a larger scale. In this drawing, you're seeing the kind of demising walls, structural walls of brick in dark red, and our desire to control the interior of the architecture through plywood, essentially. And the front facade of this project was to be entirely the existing brick, but then the back of it was to be excavated so that you would get a really generous relationship to Rock Creek in DC and exposed the wood of the interior using the excavated brick to build another level onto the building. The entrance would then bring the various levels together, and this view that opens up onto Rock Creek, revealing the two grains of wood that are at work. Running north-south, much like the brick piers are, it is transparent on one axis as a series of plywood studs, but effectively blank on the other face because there are no doors in this house. They're just sliding walls. So there's a mute series of flat screens that close off the kitchen, the family room, and the bedrooms, running essentially east-west. All of this comes into a kind of vortex in this staircase that reveals these two grains essentially working together. This is what I'm calling the tectonic grain, what I write about sometimes. Now, as a parallel to this, NADA is also NADLab, where we build some of the furniture, and when we don't, we build mock-ups of it. In this case, we did not build the millwork, but we did build the mock-ups for all of the conditions. So you're looking at a sample of the railing, you're looking at a sample of the shelving, and so forth and so on, all in the context of our 8,000 square foot workshop. But before we had this space, we were working more as conventional architects, in a representational mode. And without commissions, we would build large-scale, half-inch scale models to simulate the conditions of construction where we had no access to actual building. And so this is the first one of that series, Mill Road House, which was the first of those PA awards. And what we were interested in, this is slated for Alabama, for who used to be Monica's boyfriend at that time, who never built, but we wanted to do everything we could in American construction here with a stud frame, clapboard on one side facing the south, using the louvers as a way of protecting it from the southern sun. And then on the northern side, a combination of tongue and groove and board and batten system to modulate the wood and then fold it vertically with plywood that worked on the vertical grain but with another scale. In other words, it's not merely a pattern on the wall, it's also kinetic in some way by the way that it allows the doors to fold. Anyway, long story short, the end of that relationship did not result in the building of this, but we got to explore that, what I call the catalytic detail, through a house in New England where the board and batten becomes indicative of the barns in that area. And here you can see even the door handle is a bent piece of wood, steamed so that one adds no metal fixtures or attributes to the architecture. It's a kind of monomaterial, single medium focus, bringing two architectures together. You can see how essentially the shiplap system from one side is a coining system for what is ostensibly a board and batten system, lacerated only by one figure. That is the stair that goes up to the second floor. Years later, when we got the New Hampshire house, we realized that, okay, this is an occasion to bring it all together. All of the systems that we've been studying need to find their way finally into this house, with a fencing system, a tongue and groove system, a board and batten system, a niche system, and a wall system, all of them working on the vertical striation that then essentially encircles a courtyard overlooking the presidential range in the distance. Really a wonderful sight. So the idea of the actual prefabricated modules of the rooms are simple. It's the cladding that takes on the more complex agenda of giving figuration to the junctions and, of course, the oval courtyard, and maybe more complex, the kind of gateway that brings you into the house. The idea is that the courtyard also has a release that opens up to the view. And so what is ostensibly a very simple layout involves a great deal of complexity at the junctions, and particularly at that critical moment where the facade of the building, built up of single tongue and groove system, incrementally rotates, effectively a developable surface, a ruled surface that then becomes the canopy or the awning that draws you back into the house and towards the back, where each of the rooms gets its own porch-like condition overlooking one mountain peak at a time. So fast forward, I'll go back and forward in time because some lessons are drawn from this era and then projected onto the next era. And the Connecticut house, designed for Jackie Sococho and Carl Dalvia, close friends of mine in Northwest Connecticut, needed a very modest studio for painting and sculpture, as well as a house. We first did the studio, what you can see in the distance over there, and what was meant to be a 1,300 square foot house, more or less a mirror of my apartment in Boston, what they liked very much, which is a kind of shotgun condition. And we looked at ways in which that shotgun could eliminate the corridor and essentially activate the space so that you don't have served and servant spaces. And it resulted, I mean, we were looking at Le Corbusier's mother's house, we were looking at shotguns in New Orleans, we were looking at a range of examples. But as we looked at the low pixelated version on the left, slowly the diagram began to crystallize around a diagonal, the dark portion of which, houses the bedroom, the bathroom, the entry, the library, the kitchen, and the lighter part, which is the living spaces, essentially the living room, the dining room, and the circulation to the bedroom. And the purity of this idea became very seductive to me because it's also emblematic somehow of the direction in which we're going, which is this radical simplification of both the detailing of the buildings and the crystallization of certain ideas. And so the simplicity of this diagonal counterposed with the counter diagonal of the roof, collecting the water and essentially expelling it on the opposite grain, becomes a triangular module that then opens up onto a kind of covered awning porch space where he does some of his work, and a deck space on the opposite side that looks out over the western view. Strangely, the southern view only gets light from a clerestory because there is no view towards the south. The view is towards the west, where the living room essentially is exposed to one side. And so you're seeing here a kind of forced perspective, a cross-eyed perspective, where the diminution of dimension of the house is also part of the idea. Here, fashioned as a kind of bent diagonal beam that collapses all of the grain of the beams together, in reality got built as a simple span from one side to the other. So the house essentially is has a level cornice line on one side and sloped on the other two sides, as it goes essentially from 7'6" on one end all the way to 15 feet on the other end. So, and the book, and they're avid readers, by the way. I mean, just so I should have started out by saying that what they like about my house, or my apartment, is that there's essentially a bookshelf that's about 55 feet long that separates the living space from the kind of the poche of the bathrooms and kitchens and the bedrooms and so forth. And they're just wondering, can our books fit into this new place? I said, why not? So, so conceptually, there are no traditional rooms. It's an open loft, much like my own place. And programmatically, it's conceptualized as a series of cut sushi, if you will. The living and the fireplace on one end, the kitchen in correspondence to the dining next, the entry condition here without you seen without the porch next. Then this goes into the library. In reality, it's the stair down case. They doubled the square footage of the house without doubling the fee. And then finally, the bedroom on the opposite end. You get the picture. But this results in a singular space that's ostensibly for, a couple. And so, the acoustic issues we would normally have are not an issue, but the episodic nature in which things are broken down are articulated by the attributes that define, the living of a living room around a fireplace, the serving of the dining room from the kitchen, and so forth and so on. Here, the counter perspective towards the south, with the western light coming in, the basement that essentially becomes more storage space, a second bedroom, and a connection downstairs that then opens up into a kind of earthwork carved out with a similar view that looks out, onto the Berkshire Hills as one looks at the distance. So the basement gets ostensibly the same view as it all comes together. And the notion here, of course, is that I should have said that we built the majority of the interior ourselves with Carl himself, as there just wasn't enough budget. So we took on a lot of the fabrication scope, including the shelving and a lot of the wood lining of the interiors. The plastering was pretty straightforward. The wood floor had been done by others, but that got us focusing on a cladding system that was the combination of the tongue and groove and board and batten that I spoke of originally, with a kind of screen system that filters the light from the east in the mornings and then wraps the corners in systemic ways as you go around the building, and produces the kind of wood architecture that is at once quite simple and germane to the region, but also giving it a bit of nuance without the sense that there are facades. There are no fronts or backs to this building. So everything is designed around the notion of how one turns the corner, and even the windows serve as a kind of coining system about how it all comes together. Now, this is a simple wood stud building, but just prior to this, we had set off on a very interesting journey in Australia, where we were commissioned. We won the competition for the Melbourne School of Architecture, a pedagogical building that is not only a space of learning, but that required a kind of treatment of, let's say, didactic details that spoke to the audiences, the students and the faculty, in exemplary ways. And it was originally designed with dedicated studio spaces, which is something we take for granted in the United States. But they simply didn't have the budget for that. And so what we did was that we worked the numbers of the net to gross area such that the circulation spaces in the atrium would expand minimally to absorb also the budget of the FF&E instead of the railings, and then build out the furniture for seating, for desks, and for other things, so that there's a vertical studio space with dedicated studio space only for the visiting critics in that central totemic artifact that then hangs from the roof. Now, if you think that that idea came from somewhere, well, it certainly did, but it was a relational thing that we've been thinking about for a while. I mean, we did the suspended studio also in Georgia Tech for reasons that gave flexibility to the ground while suspending added studio space from existing trusses and a gantry crane from that roof. I'm not going to present that project today, but the notion here is that we could control the circumstances of this building and then produce this totemic artifact in a more controlled way. The Tempietto is a piece of architecture, for those of you who've seen it in Rome, that is actually a miniature. It's a folly almost. Contained within a monastic courtyard, you can see it through just an archway, entrapped in there. It has that relationship of an object to fabric. Gehry recreates that situation with his Berlin project, creating his own fabric in the neutrality of the square windows that entrap this zoomorphic figure of the conference room in the center. Now, in my opinion, Kahn does something slightly more interesting. It's not that he has a figure like the other two, but that the materiality of that figure is not only abstract, concealing the stairs that would otherwise complicate and obfuscate the issues, but the purity of the concrete drum produces a surface that then extends to become the structural frame of the building itself. In other words, there's a reciprocity between structure and skin that extends around there. And this is something we wanted to do out of that commitment, let's say, to the transformative capacity of wood to go from a load-bearing condition to a skin condition. So it starts at the top as LVLs spanning some 100 feet with coffers that bring in natural daylight but not direct sun so that you get a good quality light. And then the structure is suspended in tension with massive pieces of timber, reducing in width, and in tension, essentially diminishing to plywood by the time it gets to the bottom, where they become acoustic baffles that are suspended over the ground. What we didn't know at that time was that Melbourne has this incredible prefabrication industry, not only in wood, but also in concrete. So a building that was slated to be fabricated in 24 months was done in 18. And this has radical implications in terms of the economy of such a conception. You know, the roof, which is ostensibly very complex, was built in just weeks, with the massive pieces of coffer being delivered at early times in the morning, resulting in this kind of levity that is something that I do not believe a photograph captures very well, but enacts the kind of inversion that we were after. That is that if everything in the world that you and I know of builds up the weight and gets thinner at the top. Here we built the structure up only to suspend it back down uh, in a way that allows you to occupy the coffers and the studio spaces that are conceptually carved out of that wood at the top, and then suspended to the tensile capacity of veneers and acoustic baffles by the time that you get to the bottom. In a more straight-laced way, we've also worked with just CLT as an economic strategy for RISD, a commission that didn't allow the bells and whistles of lead commissioning and, you know, this and that kind of stamp. The president needed a dormitory to be built within a year and a half, you know, to meet the school cycle, and but also take it through community review boards and all of that. And so we had, in some way or another, to deal with the legacy of brick on the campus, the town and gown tensions between, you know, the residents of Prospect Hill, the downtown business community, and Brown campus. And the freshman quad had never really found a hub, but this became also an opportunity to give a quad, Nickerson Green, a kind of central space that acts as an urban space that connects Brown University to Woods Gary on the RISD campus. No, it doesn't look like wood because ostensibly the wood is the structure, but the building is a composition of brick, which is primarily the context, and slate, which is the roof of that same context, being brought together around a structure that was built so fast that if I had missed one of my site visits, would not have seen it erected in time. But essentially, it's not all timber. It's a hybrid system of steel and CLT, for the simple reason that if you had used wood, the depth of the beams would be so compromised by the introduction of mechanical systems. What we were able to do was to pre-drill all of the mechanical systems, from sprinklers to HVAC systems, within the steel, such that there was absolutely no waste on site. I remember that day when I went and I was walking on one of these decks, and I was asking the foreman where was all the trash, where's all the waste, and he pointed me to a small garbage bag where I saw some ends of studs being cut out of there. But essentially, they explained that this is ostensibly prefabricated, the whole thing, and that's why it went up in 3.5 weeks. All of which is to say that, you know, you get the intelligence of the system of structure, but also the warmth of the wood as the finished systems in the dormitory rooms, whether you oscillate between single windows or double windows, that then mediate with the slate of the side facades. This is on the east and west, working not with a slate of 1 foot dimensions, but 8 foot dimensions, working with, you know, strong, thin concrete panels that ostensibly are taking the shingles from other roofs and appropriating them to the skin of our building, and then using it to calibrate a dialogue with the window systems themselves. In other words, the action of the rotation of the window is the same as the shingling system itself. As it opens up, in a way, it's a monolithic strategy that mutes the side facade, as if one tectonic grain. I'll go quickly through Beaver Country Day because the systems of work are very much part of these previous projects. Suffice it to say that it's an adaptive reuse in addition to a school that has 4 different programs, 4 different buildings, bringing them all together through accessibility and a new programming of STEAM, bringing the arts and sciences in dialogue with each other, a circulatory system that makes seamless connections between all of those programs, but also a representation of them that embodies that circulation going in two directions at the same time, with a shingle system that essentially wraps the courtyard together. In the context of RISD, of course, all of this comes together in a couple of social spaces that we also got to carve smartly out of the residual spaces. Now, all of this is going well, and then all of a sudden, COVID happens, and all systems stop, and we're called to do something for the Venice Biennale, and so we're trying to bring all of this together in an exhibit that is scaling up from the dimension of a house to a dimension of a row house to an apartment building to a warehouse and so forth and so on. So the studies that we did on CLT, of which I'll only show a couple here, effectively try to radicalize what is it that one might be able to do with this medium. And in one such occasion, right around the corner of my own house on Washington Street in the south end of Boston, there was an empty site, and I noticed that several developers are visiting it. And the only reasonable financial model that could tolerate construction in the inner city was to effectively to double its height. And so there is precedent for that also, where you get on Commonwealth Avenue, you get a bookend condition, which was probably built before historic conservation disallowed this kind of construction. But there's something interesting about the end bay of that block being able to do something civic at a scale that the regular row house is not able to do. In the context of this site, though, it's a much skinnier site. So the row house typology doesn't tolerate as many stairs as you may think you need. Because if you put those stairs, you would have no space for an apartment. And therefore, again, your business model would die. So what we did is that we took the two means of egress and we intersected them, a kind of double helical core outside of the elevator, of course, but with the premise that the fire stair is used as part of your unit on a daily basis, and the automated doors close at the moment that it becomes a fire stair. It's an inversion of the code entirely. And what this allows is that you get two nested units with primary living spaces and then a kind of galleyway on the edges where you get stacked bedroom galleys and office spaces. Anybody who's familiar with the Shim Sutcliffe laneway house knows that thin space in which the kids slept. This is modeled after that idea. And what's smart about this, of course, is that it has the flexibility where units are not only separated, but possibly can be conjoined linearly or vertically, depending on how you want to use the stairs. And so there's these moments where spaces that you associate with exits become part of your unit. Obviously, a complex real estate transaction and a redefinition of real estate law, bringing these two conditions together. Now, in terms of construction, then, this also allows you to work with the CLT plank at the larger scale, using the thickness of the CLT not only as structure, but also as part of the mass with insulation on top of it to create a kind of thermal barrier. So the entire elevation of it is one plank carved with a very thin liminal space that gives a ribbon window for the galley areas to look out, with the full glass elevations only on the ends. As a demonstration about what we could do with CLT, Hashem Sarkis asked us, well, what if you do a full-scale installation, a gateway to the waterfront, the Vaporetto stop on the north side of the Biennale, and we tried to look at a system where the grain of the wood becomes participant to its structural performance. I'll try to go fast here, but I won't talk about the form of it, but suffice it to say it's a long linear canopy that is the result of a series of panels that are conjoined in this kind of V-shaped nested situation. Let's see if this works. The stacking of the CLT as a construction system produces layers that are invisible to your eye once they're put together. But as you start routing into it, you see the cross grain emerging. I mean, if you were to taper it according to a cantilever, this is what you would begin to see as it goes from the structural core of the center to the edges. The excavation of holes into it allows for the placement not only of nested panels next to it, but columns that penetrate it and support it from underneath. The patterning of the reflected ceiling plan is then, of course, a central part of its structural core, not its surface. Needless to say, very expensive. So we were afforded one plank, and out of that one plank, we had to cut everything out and create, let's say, the maximum effect. And so we looked back onto the symbol of Venice, the lion that holds an open book to kind of invite you, to welcome you to the city. And we use the different parts, you know, the beam as the threshold from the Vaporetto stop, the book holding it up, and the foundation, because you're not allowed to drill into the ground, as a counterweight for the cantilever. Pax tibi marche evangelista meus is that message of welcoming, what is effectively framed on the inside of the support, and the stones of Venice as the counterpoint on the opposing end that holds up the cantilever from the other side. Now, this is just, you know, a game that we play, but more importantly, this becomes even more interesting when you realize, well, what if, you know, this CLT can become the formwork for a building itself. And in the context of the Melbourne School of Design, you know, you use it as the formwork for the concrete, and you have, you know, steel rebar in there. And much like RISD as a composite system, these two systems start working together to create the platforms that frame the entire atrium of the learning space. Now, our investment is not only in design, obviously. You can see that the way that we're working is wholly invested in the means and methods of construction, a term I had not even understood or heard of when we entered into architecture. This is our first built project. budgeted at around $230,000 for a restaurant of 6,000 square feet. A hookah den, which is this little pagoda here, was budgeted by the contractor at, I forget now, $170,000 or something like that, leaving us just a little scrap of money for the entire restaurant. And we didn't understand how they did their evaluation of the budget. We didn't understand the politics of construction. We didn't understand that he simply didn't want to build it. And so he priced it to ensure that it will never get built. But what we did was very naive and simplistic, but it worked out. We simply printed the drawing at full scale and then glued it onto the ceiling and then started hanging plumb bobs and realized that we could build about 6 or 7 layers per day, meaning that we could build the entire thing in 30 days for $30,000, including the material and a bit of profit. And this is our first construction piece that we did in-house. And so we had, let's say, about $200,000 left for the rest of the restaurant. Now, this is normative understanding to the most of you, but wasn't for us because we also didn't have much practical training in other offices. As our practice developed, this is now, I don't know, 10, 15 years later, we were, let's say well seasoned by then and working with more complicated technologies, but unfortunately we were granted the contractors of Dunkin' Donuts to build bank restaurants. And we quickly realized that they simply don't have the capacity to handle the complex geometries that are the kind of shrink wrapping of the mechanical systems that were inherited from the top of this building into the space of the restaurant. That would be a kind of open space that is only interrupted by the wine room, the column, and the bulges, which are a kind of approximation of the mechanical systems as they are shrink wrapped above. And it became a great exercise for us. We did not build this ourselves. The contractors did end up building it, but we ended up becoming the project managers, as it were, not on the architect side, but on the construction side of things. So everything that had to do with tolerances and with jigs and with the assignment of wood pieces was incredibly complex and became part of our task. But that also set us up for larger public projects like the Adams Library, which uses what visually seems the same, a striated system. But the striated system now is a combination of acoustic baffles, lighting, sprinkler systems, mechanical diffusers, and of course, the beams of the roof itself, all as a raw expression of what I call the 6th elevation, the RCP. The 5th, of course, is the roof itself, which is visible from the triple deckers of the neighborhood. A single-story library that let's say embodies the aspirations of a more civic, a more public, a more exposed and engaged program for the neighborhood, has a civic front in a single pitch, but then broken down into multiple pieces as it joins into the neighborhood in the back. This animation will attempt to explain that if it ever starts. So a kind of reinterpretation of the McKim Mead and White's longhouse, the breaking down of that system of the roof into ruled surface towards the back, emulating the pitches of the lower roofs, catching all of the water into a cistern and in the rain garden in the back, excavating the south and bringing light deep into the building, making space for 2 gardens and saving the oak tree on the north, dividing the programs between the adults, the adolescents, and the kids on the north-south axis, but the beams then run east-west, embodying the kind of space of those interiors that divides between the civic and the domestic. One then inhabits that space. That ceiling becomes a symbolic form that is experienced as it goes out and then frames the outdoor reading rooms and the oak tree and the herb garden and becomes part of the architecture of connecting back to the sidewalk on one side and some of the kids' areas on the other. There are many projects, of course, in here besides wood, and I'm trying to also communicate the importance of the one single most neglected architecture in the world today, and that is the reflected ceiling plan. And so a lot of our architecture goes right there, and we leave everything else alone. Not wood, but an important piece for us, because obviously it needs form work, and that invariably becomes a wooden byproduct. But typologically very important, because the hinge of this building, a courtyard house, is a stair that is not only circulational, but is the structure of the building itself. The staircase at the 2 corners, on the bottom right and the upper left, become a hinge between the bedrooms on the ground floor and the living and master bedrooms on the top, encircling a swimming pool that becomes part of the structural narrative of this building. Conceptually, seen as a courtyard building, it would look inside. But actually, we fashion it to look over the Mediterranean on one side and towards the bosque of Pinus Pinei on the other side. Not flat, but a sloped site. The project builds up according to the hill, maintaining a space of privacy on the interior, but then opening up onto the context, and most importantly, allowing the landscape to flow right through it, into its core, and then up into the forest. Conceptually, we had imagined an architecture that might speak to an architecture of concrete. And that is to say that we activate critically the idea of aggregate, as you are so familiar with here, and play games with that, imagining that on the interior where they may have art, it's smooth, but as it goes into the landscape, the panelization of this poured concrete may evolve as it engages the actual stone walls of southern France. And so the figure ground relationship between the aggregate and the cement changes such that it just becomes a stone wall by the end. Needless to say, expensive. So as we came back down to the ground, to the earth, we realized that with a simple sandblasting of the wood, that there's something interesting that can happen between the excavation of the earth, which is pretty radical if you think about it, reveals this incredibly warm, amber ground, and that the grain of that wood, once sandblasted, is radicalized in the way that it captures the light, but also the depth of the shadow that imparts. And so even though the general form of the building may not always communicate that, this is what this is what the house leaves behind as an impression. It's maybe of the architectures that we've built, the best crafted and the most investment that we've put in. Quickly now, as COVID was happening, part of the Biennale project was really self-serving. It was a house for myself in Connecticut, not far from Jackie and Carl's house, with the notion that it would be fully in CLT. But that really doesn't make sense, and I'll tell you why. First and foremost, we also were interested in a genealogy of buildings. You can see here the castle that Lucan always refers to in the served and servant spaces of the load-bearing walls, reinterpreted on the right in the era of typology by Jorge Silvetti in a series of enfilades on the edges with a courtyard in the center, never at the right dimension. In other words, they're too narrow as living rooms and possibly too wide as bathrooms, or too long as bedrooms. Nonetheless, a brilliant idea that brings all of this around with a circulatory edge rather than a core. We were intent on getting this right. And so there is a part of our practice also that refuses to design. We only correct other people's work. So imagine a room that is the size of a double bed with a closet in one side behind you and a kitchenette on the other side with just one window. Because the stair is going around the building, each floor is the bedroom of each floor is always perpendicular to the next. So effectively, it's a 4-story tower with each bed looking in a different direction. And it can be used as independent apartments or one house. But then there's the poché space. There's the space at the stair, and when it's not a stair, then it's a shower, a toilet, a bunk bed, or just some study space. But it's just the right dimension for just that. I mean, it's about 3 feet, 3 foot 6 inches. The problem then is that it's just not a great idea to put plumbing and electrical services routed out of CLT. It just doesn't make sense. And so we make this one hybrid also. Excuse me. The diagram on the right shows that the thickness on the outside, of course, is CLT with insulation on the outside, but the services are always in the hollow core of the interior liner. And this produces a condition whereby that staircase is activated on two edges in two different ways. The served and servant spaces are then critical to this, where you see the occupiable black zones, which effectively double the square foot of the house and functionalize it in ways that it would never be able to have. So here in this key image, you see the way in which you occupy a poché zone, the veneer of the plywood, on the right-hand side, the main space of the bedroom, and then the looking down into the staircase on the other side. Okay, I end quickly with Nebraska before you come up on stage. And I want to go very quickly on this because it's just the thing that I like about this project is that finally we're able to distill some of these lessons and make them with 4 details alone. That's it. We were thinking of Danny Castor's beautiful jellyfish drawings as we were doing this, because as we emerged, we wanted to do a warehouse in the way that the barns of Nebraska have striated, corrugated metal paneling. Turned out to be too expensive. How could corrugated metal be expensive? Well, the reason is it's not the corrugated metal. It's that is going on a stud frame that has sheathing and insulation, and then inner finishes, and these are all different trades. The brilliant Calwall manufacturer said, I can do all of that with one product. And that's really the story of this building, that the combination of mass timber, CLT, and Calwall brings it all together in a synthetic moment. And I'll try to be brief on this one. Urbanistically, the building comes together through the link building that existed prior to when we came, and we reactivated an auditorium that had become obsolete into 3 or 4 rooms. We made urban rooms on either side of our intervention, bringing the 4 buildings together around an outdoor classroom. So the building, in a way, is a new front face to the whole complex, but it's also robbing the infrastructure of the link building so that we do not waste any money on services and have a poche space of crit rooms and conference rooms with a CLT structure, the Cal wall skin, and a new front facade, new front entry on the north face where you get the natural light of the building. Now, one of the things that complicates this building also is that the existing buildings from the late 1800s and the early 1900s don't align. And so our building has to negotiate all of the circulatory systems so that they are accessible. But it also acts as the connection back to the campus. And so that inner core of the building then juts out and establishes that connection with the multiple levels. Urbanistically, then, the building is doing something very important because it acts as a kind of hinge point between 2 very important things of the campus. One is the Sheldon Museum by Philip Johnson, an architect who's never been a favorite of mine, but did an extraordinary building there. It's I believe, his best. And then, of course, the football games of Nebraska, which are arguably far more important than the culture of the arts, where about 90,000 people come together on 7 or 8 occasions a year, but they are willing to drive over 9 hours to get there. So I got that experience firsthand. But our building happens at the nexus of these occasions, bringing these 2 axes together. And it serves as a kind of home base for some of the alumni events that happen there. The face of this building then speaks to these 2 processions. One looking towards the east, back at the museum. So there are windows in this translucent facade. And the other one west, towards the promenade that takes you to the football games. I would never have believed that. I mean, this is a narrative we were told. We didn't believe in it, but then we designed around it, and then we experienced it firsthand. It's real. Part of the building is also invested in this idea of exposing the structure in these nested spaces that are extensions of the exhibition space. So the exhibition opens out onto the west, but also has a double height space protected for the construction. They have a very good design build program there where they build things outside, and has a direct view of that lobby, and the extension of which is part of the entry space, and the revelation of the staggered floors that don't completely align but come together at this critical juncture where the studio space produces a theater onto another space, bringing that together with the facade, and a coordination with the mechanical lighting and sprinkler systems, which are ostensibly simple, but nonetheless the kinds of things that needed to get resolved in a very rationalized and thoughtful way, albeit exposed. And the mediation between that as an autonomous building and the poche spaces that connected back to the existing facade of the 19th century building, no, excuse me, the 20th century building, where the cornice lines of that building serve as seats for the crit spaces. So I'll end with simply a narrative about, not wood, but wood and architecture as actuality and fiction. When we look at the Greek temple, we have come to naturalize the ornament as an essential part of its architecture. But it took me some time as a student to understand that the stone building that is the temple is in some way a petrification of a purported wood structure that it once was. And that in fact, that the triglyphs are the embodiment of the end grain of those members of the truss, the wood roof, as they hit the outer entablature. Now, if you're willing to accept that fiction and how wood transforms into stone, let's see if you can swallow this. The triglyphs, because of the way that they give order to the building, need to turn the corner. And they do so by becoming offset in the outer corner, resolving themselves at a syntactic level. Linguistically, they resolve the buildings. But you and I well know that the beams can't go in both directions at one time. And so, despite our ability and our capacity to master the technical achievements of architecture, we're always already somehow entrenched in linguistic as a basis for addressing the technical. And so this is why much of the lecture has slalomed back and forth between the actualities and the fictions and the narratives that bring this all together. Thank you.
Don't mind.
I think yours is on, mine's on.
Yeah, okay.
That was fantastic. It's very inspiring, beautiful work. Always a pleasure hearing you speak about your work. I guess just for the audience, I've known Nader for at least 35 years. The first projects I saw included the hookah space that Nader presented in the restaurant, and we've always connected whenever the opportunity has arisen. So one thing I just want to ask you, I'm going to ask you some questions. I guess I'll start with a personal question. So where does your erudite nature come from? Like, it's obviously very much a part of you, and that's going to lead to some other questions about language and the analytique, animation analytique, it's like I know you always say that, or you've said it a few times, that um, something to the effect that when you came to Arizona, you learned how to build. And so our connection is through my mentor, Will Bruder.
Yep.
And and yet what I would say is it's clear that you're constructing your language as a construction.
Mm-hmm.
Your drawing is a construction.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you learned how to build, but constructing and building an argument or building a building is something in your DNA, let's say. So first question is,
So
where's that come from?
I start with the anecdote and then I answer the question. It's true that I came here to Arizona in great part because the Phoenix Public Library was published just before we got the PA award for Casa La Roca, on which Will Bruder served as a jury member. And I was completely captivated by the library, but was completely incredulous when I got an anonymous phone call from some guy that introduced himself as Will Bruder, saying that he wanted to come visit our studio, which he did. I realized that he's a real person. And just off the cuff, and I didn't write back then, and I'd never written anything before. I asked him, well, what if I wrote something on your library? It would be nice to be able to come visit it. He said, yeah, come on over. And that's when I met you. Soon thereafter, he explained to me that actually, at a critical point, he wasn't even there. He was in Rome or something like that. So you were left stranded in the office. And you know best, what you designed, what you changed, and what you did together. But it was a critical part, let's say, of my education in American architecture. And when I say American, I don't mean American architecture in the big sense. I mean today. There's something about that building that made me realize that if all of the architecture that I was educated with in the 80s, and I'm talking about Eisenman and Graves and Meyer, was rooted in the 2x4, the 2x6 stud wall covered in either plaster or sheetrock. It never, and whenever they did poche, it was always stuck within the logic of a wood frame structure. It never gained the massiveness, the thickness of a load-bearing wall, nor the thinness of a curtain wall, for that matter. What I loved about the library is that it radicalizes the thin unapologetically. And that is a trope that you know very well. We have absorbed as if it were our own from that building. Ponti did that in the 60s. Gardella did that. There are others who've done that, but not in the context of today's technologies. But anyway, there was something about that. And then there was, you're going to tell us which house it is, but there's that simple concrete block wall in Bruder's house that corbels and leans out slightly.
The Byrne residence.
The Byrne residence. And that suggested a transformational capacity that only a block can do because of the dimension of the block as being essentially a pixel of construction. that too was something we had in common already in the Casal Roca house, where every block is assigned its own geometry and location in space.
My question was, okay, so I know some of that, and I think it's good that the audience is here, but for students, I'm kind of curious to go back further, maybe to where you're born, and you know, I'm talking at a young age, as you made the decision to go into architecture. What prompted that?
It's much more simple. There's no mystification here. I was a solid C minus student in high school, and back then it was easier to get in college, easier than today to get in college, but not with a C minus, frankly. And so the people in my high school worked very hard to get me over the lip into RISD, which is an art school, and in the context of a place that pushes people into the Harvards and Yales, it was easy to push me into RISD, and I got on the waiting list and I took it. But, so I didn't really study in high school, but I was very diligent at RISD, and I got into it, and I'll explain a little bit of that background to you.
And why RISD?
It was the only school, like, besides Bennington, I got into. I didn't have a choice. So, again, no mystery there.
And so you went to the school that's known for, you don't have to declare your major until after the
That's
first.
the amazing part about RISD, is that you get 1 year of play in any of the arts, and then, you know, eventually you either get bullied into going to architecture because it allegedly makes you more money than painting or something like that. But there is another story behind this, is that, you know, I did grow up in 4 years at a time in different countries, which did not, it gave me a good, let's say, worldly understanding of cultures, but it didn't give me a good foundation in neither language nor history nor a grounded identity. But somehow I gained something through visuality and, let's say, the environments in which I would walk, either new construction sites or archaeological sites. And those were some early kind of inclinations that I said, well, this is interesting. What is this? But the part of me that you call erudite is actually not a scholarly one. I think of myself more as an accidental academic, but I can't handle something if I don't understand it. And so the capacity to either explain it or to understand it allows me then to enter into its constellation. So when you see me struggling on stage to describe something, or when you
I didn't see you struggling.
anyway, for me, there's, you know, there's this thing that we all do as we're designing. There's some things we do a priori. We've thought it through, but we need to test it out to see whether it works. And then through iteration, that idea gets embodied into the image. But actually, the opposite is even more productive sometimes. You don't know what you're doing. You go ahead and do it enough times that you can post-rationalize it. And the animations are a result of both of these. They're an embodiment of some ideas that we came into the project with, and some ideas that we ended up with after we edited out and threw other things out. But the narrative, the storytelling, and the ability to explain something is a central part of this urge, this impulse.
So, just to kind of continue with that, I think what Will saw in participating and honoring the project, the first of, was it the first, second of 19 PA Design Awards? We were so happy when we won one. And then I think shortly thereafter, the magazine collapsed. But that's pretty impressive. For those that don't know, the PA Design Award was a very prestigious award, one of the three original architectural magazines in America that is no longer. But it's interesting the naivete relative to construction that you talk about, but it was always about how you were always trying to think through how something is built. I loved seeing that image of the house in Alabama again, and just very subtly thinking about it differently, but working within the limits. You said something about this house, this kind of imaginary project that you're imagining that you might do for these developers that are meeting on this site. I'm assuming you maybe did, you just decided to do it, or would you really hired, or would you just, is like an impetus to think about an interesting problem? But you mentioned something, that this inversion of the code, and I think we were talking before, and you were talking about Nebraska, and it, one thing that I talk about, like when I'm contacted by a potential client, is that, I say I wouldn't know what to do with the blank canvas. I would just stare at it. I'm an architect because I revel in constraints and being creative within those parameters, whatever those might be. And actually, the more stringent those parameters, the more creative I become, because I'm just ready to bolt at the chance to solve a new problem or to think through something. And that challenge, I mean, you also mentioned before the lecture, that you said a couple of times, you were kind of explaining the lecture. I hadn't seen this exact lecture, and we were talking about it. And you said, well, the argument. And so, but it's interesting, the tools that you have honed for yourself to explain what you do and to understand what you are going to do, or this journey that you've never been on before, and how you're going to make it happen.
Well, one of the things that we discussed right before we got on stage, and I hadn't thought of this in a while, but I realized that it's at the core of a lot of the projects, whether furniture or buildings, is this tension between configurative thinking and figurative thinking. And by that, I mean that...
Please, for me, just explain
All right, so
those two words.
when you think of a building by Frank Gehry, the emphasis is on the figure of the building. It doesn't matter what it looks like, but it matters that he's sculptural. He works in models primarily, and he sculpts buildings, whether as planes or as masses. If you look closely at the details, I mean, they're not that great, but they're thought through. If you look at, let's say, a Renzo Piano building, the ones that I like happen to be the matte horizontal museum buildings, because they're systems buildings. If you understand one structural bay, you actually understand the entire building, because the part to whole relationships that he displays between structure, envelope, cladding, and all of that, is totalizing. But the architects that do the configurational work well are rarely the same ones that do the figurative work well. They never came together. And there was something in the signal box of Herzog and de Meuron of that moment that made that link for me. That the emergence of a figure in some way displays a different level of rigor and discipline where the part to whole relationship is reconciled. And I said, okay, they did that with copper. What would that mean in shingles? What would that mean in block? What would that mean in brick? What would that mean in glass? And if you look at the early projects, almost every single one of them is a deliberate attempt to reconcile the figurative with the configurative. And if they didn't meet that test, they would fail the litmus test, essentially, for me. Now, that's uptight, I know, but I still stand by it somehow.
Yeah, well, let's, so how does art or certain art influence your work? And so you were just mentioning Gary, and you were just mentioning Herzog and Long.
Yeah.
They're both influenced by certain artists that were constructing in a different way. I'm talking about for Herzog and Long, like the Donald Judd and work like that, and yet with Gary, it's something else. So, you know, the kind of art, the way you're thinking about your work, is it influenced by that at all, or is it more influenced by thinking about construction, or you're getting at something else maybe with, but it's interesting that you would take the signal box and think, how does this apply to all the materials you just mentioned?
Right. Look, it's hard to imagine that I would not be thinking of art coming from RISD. RISD was socially and educationally kind of braided with all of those disciplines. You saw painters and filmmakers and sculptors and illustrators and ceramicists on a daily basis. But you had to also come to terms with not only what is irreducible about each medium, but also what's different about them. I think, you know, of the artists and the tendencies that are out there, we were looking in that period, and which still is alive today, we were looking at minimalist art on the one hand and landscape art on the other, because they had an almost direct application to what we were trying to achieve. The landscape art registered an ambiguity between architecture as object versus architecture as environment, dissolving the scene between the ground and the constructed ground. And from the point of view of minimalism, the capacity to erase the majority of what the conventional world imposes on us means that there's a difficult task of overcoming the mundane. You know, how do you get the gutter of a building without seeing the gutter? How do you, you know, how do you conceal a mullion when you know it has to be 2x6 or something like that? You know, all of these, in some way, I think that the construction industry, particularly in the US, is so sophisticated from the perspective of products that it disallows architecture. Whereas you can build almost anything in China, in Chile, or in Iran because there is no construction industry. There's still almost a craft or trade-based situation where customization doesn't involve a premium, but is the norm. So one can still build ideas rather than approximate an idea with a product. And I think one of the killers of architecture here is in a way, the calcification of a discipline as a kind of acquiescence to industry standards. So I think what art does well is that it erases, all of the things that we're subjugated to as a profession. And I'm using profession here as a four-letter word.
It's interesting, though, you just on the heels of that, I think it was interesting to you close with this project where the only solution is a product.
Exactly.
Cow wall. I think a few people were like behind me, like,
Well,
and yet
they
you know,
advertised it a lot because apparently it gave it new life or something like that.
you bet it. But it's interesting how the again constraints are you have a solution, it doesn't meet the budget. You have another solution, it still doesn't meet the budget. And and then you're forced.
Yeah.
You're absolutely forced. And yet it's maybe something, I mean, you were saying earlier, it's like four details. I mean, we've arrived at four details.
Right. I mean, the ability to figure out how to bring the CLT to an edge, to waterproof it, particularly with the difficulty of a cow wall that's angled in plan versus an eccentric slope of the coping, right? And so that encapsulates the complexity of that. There are no custom windows to that. At best, on the west edge, they have added fins that are attached to them to give them depth. But other than that, it's just the product and the abstraction. Well, Cowell is abstract, and if you can dimension it such that, in this instance, that it's virtually completely striated, the optical effect, let's say the op-art effect it gets, has to do with the staggering in two directions. So the light is doing most of the legwork for you, not the product. So there's a displacement of the product with the effect of the light.
I was thinking when you said it's real and these images of these football fans and they're walking next to your building and they kind of are forced to because you thought that is something you should engage, or if and you did, that maybe your building will recruit some architects.
As football players?
No, that maybe they'll like, wow, what is this? I mean, there's so, I guess it's like this studio that I've taught a few times. It'll never happen, but my photographer and I, this Earth Curvature studio, and the idea of doing something that has a massive audience, a kind of passive audience. So I just, maybe because of that project, I was imagining 80,000 fans, or maybe half of them walking by your building. you know, it might,
Let's be honest.
yeah.
Our, our building is a small blip on the radar. Football is so big there that we're just
You know,
lucky to be on their
you know,
pilgrimage path. I mean,
exactly, exactly. But I don't know, you were saying that, you know, the arts have no importance, but maybe,
I just didn't imagine that when they said actually they will have major fundraising and alumni events there, I didn't realize that so many people would descend on this small town and do so much. And it just happens that the architecture building is on a strategic corner. And they did actually do all of that. I mean, I went there, the opening of the building coincided with, one of the key games they played against Chicago. They lost, by the way. And so, the theater wasn't there for us. We were just part of the theater by showing up because the photographer was going to come, and we lived, a day in the life of that building, just understanding, you know, first of all, that, motel prices go up 3 times during that weekend, and that you could never get an Uber back home that night because you have to, and there's no sidewalks to get home that night, because you have to go on highways. Anyway, it's a complicated story, but it's a phenomenon. The football game is a thorough phenomenon, and we are just a very small part of that.
okay, we probably have maybe time for one additional question. So you certainly showed this, you touched on it, but you're not, this isn't that lecture, but I'm interested in how you arrived at the animate analytique, and there's a story there I think would be interesting to share.
So, I showed 2 or 3 animations. One of the Villa Barroise in southern France, one of the Nebraska School of Architecture, and maybe another one, where the animation is not only a kinetic image that explains the building, broadly speaking, but more importantly, it's a series of still images that are woven together seamlessly in different modalities. And what I mean by that is that often they will go from a plan depiction to a sectional condition, or from a plan to axon, and then later from axon to an exploded condition, or from an exploded condition to a synthetic condition, or then changing the lens from an isometric view to a perspectival view, which really means you're going from a kind of infinite lens to a conical lens that you can do at a wide angle or less than wide angle. But it suggests that in some way, as architects, we don't just illustrate buildings, we construct our arguments through the instrumentality of their representational mode. So an argument in perspective might be done through a conical projection, but an argument about a reflected ceiling plan would require, let's say, a Choisy axonometric. Or the diagram of an urban plan may be done in a plan, whereas a topographical argument connecting that part of the city to that part of the city would be done in section. And the animate analytique is like, a French analytique drawing that has on one esquisse board, a column at half-inch scale, a site plan at 1/32, a section at 1/4 scale. The composite nature of the analytique, in all of its conservative flavor, it was something that called on me to say that there's, through 4 fragments you understand the whole. And I realized that in some way the animation is a very interesting way of getting at something that architects do all the time. The way that we look at history is just different than the way that historians look at it. There's a difference between diachronic and synchronic history. A historian will look at a building and they will try to unpack the economic, the political, and the social circumstances of which that building is a part. Now, whether it's a byproduct of that or whether it contributes to that, it's that dynamic that they try to identify. But as architects, we're very comfortable to look at a courtyard house in the Renaissance, a courtyard house in Yazd, Iran, and a courtyard house in a case study house, and conflate them together. And that capacity to do so, in my mind, was a way of working through animations that conflated irreconcilable matter into one synthetic story. And so if you think that architects have this appreciation of looking at a medieval etching on one side, at one thing, a cubist painting, and a piece of descriptive geometry and synthesizing them together, to me, these drawings are exactly like that. They have this capacity to demonstrate the agency of representation, not as pictures of architecture, but as a way of thinking through architecture as you're working through it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good way to end, and I would say it's a way for you to think. I think in the PA Design Awards, and maybe when you weren't building, it was a way for you to. It felt like you were building, and that led to, the opportunities that are the foundation of your practice. And I think the other thing is it certainly it allows you to I think it allows you to win competitions. It allows you to explain how the building works. It's a way of talking that is more effective than talking. It's like the animate analytique more than the traditional analytique with today's tools and thinking, utilizing that. It's almost a language that it's a language you've kind of
To be clear,
expanded.
it's also a critique of the fly-through. As
Much
like products,
yeah.
The fly-through became the kind of de facto
Doesn't explain
requirement
anything.
for, but it became a de facto requirement for every competition.
Yeah.
And really, yes, we also do competitions. We also try to get clients. But the reality is that we work hard with students primarily to work through the problem of thinking itself. I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous, but in a strange way, what I like about architecture is, what I like about teaching is that it allows for a discipline that is always in some way anachronistic. That you're allowed to speak to people that are dead over 200 years, and you're allowed to imagine that you're speaking to somebody who's not yet been born, because there are certain disciplines and modes of working that can not be aligned with the exact conditions of work today. That's what makes it so exciting.
Thank you.
Announcement. Thank you so much. That was an amazing conversation. I'm sorry there weren't time for questions at the end, but we're going to continue into a reception. For those who are staying for the fundraising dinner, there's a special invitation to go to Janie Ellis's studio. So Alex, where are you? Alex over there will lead you to that. For those who are not staying for dinner, there will be a reception in the back. So feel free to take your time leaving, grab a glass of wine. If you're not sure where you're going, you're interested in joining for the dinner, do let me know. I'll be just standing right here. Okay, thank you.